You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a philosophy podcast by some guys who were at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. Our question for episode 44 is something like, should we be religious? We read recent selections from four writers, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Dennett. Look at partiallyexaminedlife.com for more information. My name is Mark Linsenmeyer, proselytizing to the extreme from Madison, Wisconsin.
This is Seth Paskin, anxiously apprehending the gang of people leaving the prayers in Austin, Texas.
This is Wes Alwyn in Boston, Massachusetts.
This is Dylan Casey in Middleton, Wisconsin.
All right. So specifically, we're reading in Sam Harris's The End of Faith from 2004, the first two chapters, the last three chapters of Christopher Hitchens' 2007 classic God is Not Great. Primarily chapter 4, also some of chapter 2 from Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, and primarily chapter 8, although you kind of have to read some of the early ones, maybe 3 and 7 from Dan Dennett's Breaking the Spell. The Dawkins and the Dennett are both from 2006. And these are a good example of readings that when we started this podcast, I desperately wanted to avoid. Because they're barely philosophical. I mean, Dan Dennett is the only actual philosopher of the bunch.
That's reflected in his writing style.
Well, I guess Sam Harris is getting a dissertation.
Harris is doing a PhD in neuroscience.
Yep.
I thought he had a PhD in neuroscience, but he was getting one in philosophy.
No.
All right, so he did some philosophy undergrad.
He has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from bumfuck community college.
So he's a success story because he wrote this huge best-selling philosophy book.
It says he's a graduate of philosophy from Stanford University.
There you go, based on an undergrad degree. You can do it too.
Yes, when I say bumfuck community college, I mean the quality of his reasoning, not his actual institution.
What exactly are we going to try to answer on this podcast?
Folks should be aware, if you've not listened to episode 43, there's where we actually considered the classical arguments for the existence of God. And I really see these readings as more political. Like, when I was trying to come up with reading selections in these in the first place, I had my eye out for, do they talk about these classical arguments? What do they have to say about them? But for the most part, even though some of them treat the arguments, they're treated with such brevity. There's not really a serious attempt, I feel, to...
Only Dawkins tries to really offer it.
I'm sure Hitchens at least brings them up in a sneering way for a second.
He does, yeah.
In what we read of Hitchens,
okay, right,
we just get the totalitarianism as a form of religion thing.
Yes. We've gotten a request to do these. We feel things that are, I don't know, I don't want to make this a general rule, but one of the things that we're open to covering is anything that is considered philosophy and is having some impact on public discourse currently. It might be nice for us to read if we can stomach it. But I feel like these guys are, for the most part, and I would exclude Dennett from most of what I have to say here. But the other three guys are more concerned with the political, how do we keep atheists from being marginalized? How do we instead marginalize people of faith? So there's some actual argumentation about the substance. You know, it's not reasonable to believe in God, but a lot more of it seems to me to be whether it's rebutting the claims of theists that it provides them some advantage, that it provides, whether it be a necessity for peace of mind and meaning in life, or especially, I believe all four of the books deal in some way with the question, are religious people more moral than non-religious people? So it's about rebutting those things, and it's attacking the concept of faith in general, right?
Yeah, I think even though these readings aren't the highest quality, I mean, the question is still intrinsically interesting, which is it reasonable to believe in God? Is it reasonable to be religious? And their answer, of course, is no, it's not. It's not reasonable even to be agnostic. And there is a lot of good, of course, philosophical work done on that. And one of those is Mackey's book, which we can bring to bear.
So let's start with the Harris. Before we get to that, I mean, what were your experiences slogging through this stuff?
I agree that a lot of it was political in the sense that, I guess the way Hitchens' book is titled, How Religion Poisons Everything, they're clearly going after a particular brand of religion, which they consider to be either on the rise or too much a part of the political landscape that is not interested in playing well with others. It's not hard to come up with examples of it. And they consider it to be they don't ever use the word politics, but essentially a serious political problem for civil society. And they try to bring to bear both people who are religious, who don't think this is a good idea, as well as arguments against the kinds of claims that are often made by this particular corner. In general, I found that their arguments are essentially preaching to the choir in the end for the kinds of audience that they have as far as the dangers of extreme fundamentalism or literal readings. But it's the same argument that's been going on about religions, for hundreds and hundreds of years. Spinoza has the same kinds of arguments, but he goes at it from a different standpoint. He brings to bear the scripture itself and says, well, what we need to do is have a revision of our understanding of biblical interpretation for this. So rather than coming at it from the standpoint of being atheist, which is not going to convince anybody who's a believer to play well with others, the arguments against things like violence and even totalitarianism and stuff like that within religion weren't even going to address those who were partisans of it, right? There's nothing in there that was going to convince somebody who was a Muslim theist in Iran, or theocracy advocate in the United States to abandon those positions and believe in the good of civil society.
Well, Harris has addressed, in a way, or at least he's attacking them, religious moderates who he thinks are the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Good, liberal, religious moderates who say we ought to tolerate. He's making that argument against tolerance.
Yeah, he's making an argument about the problems of tolerance, which, I guess you would sum up as, if the other side isn't going to be swayed by it, then your tolerance, all it does is lead to enabling their totalitarianism. But, again, he also isn't providing an argument that's going to persuade the other side about why they ought to participate in civil society.
I don't think it's even persuasive to agnostics. Harris has a few themes. One of them is that these religious beliefs lead to violence. And then the other is that if we had more respect for evidence, we wouldn't have any religious beliefs at all, and we'd be much better off.
Yeah, I guess in just sort of summing up my reaction before trying to get into it about the specific guys, I was surprised the extent to which they were focusing on pointing out the difficulties and atrocities and so forth within organized religion, which aren't hard to point to. And they were relatively unsophisticated about analyzing the theme of totalitarianism and the relationship between politics and religion. But they also did not try to make an argument for the benefit of civil society, period, which is sort of a classic argument regarding religion, even qualifying the tolerance issue and saying along the lines of Harris and wanting to say, well, look, there's limits to our tolerance. None of them go sort of the liberal democracy route of saying that what really has to happen is a kind of trumping of religious sentiment in the goal of civil society that enables the genuine freedom of religious activity. So from the standpoint of a hardcore theist or theocracy advocate, they would immediately recognize that that's just a simple neutering of a deist argument for its primacy in political life, which it is. But that's sort of what gets embraced in liberal democracy. None of them make that sort of Spinoza-style argument.
I read the end of the Dennett book, which is why I think most of these introductory things we're saying don't really apply to him. That he does ultimately, I think, come down on the side of these things have to be able to compete in sort of the marketplace of ideas. And that is not necessarily all cashed out in some strict scientific verificationist kind of everything has to be testable, but certainly if it comes to things that spark religion and that close your mind to other things, then that's the only thing that we really need to watch out for, which is in some ways the same point that the others are making, that faith itself, right? If faith is something that I will hold fast to this idea and I will not be open to discussion, that is the decay, that is the end of deliberation, that's the end of something that a liberal democracy requires.
Yeah, but you don't really care about that in terms of liberal democracy unless it's true of everybody, right? What you care in liberal democracy is whether people buy into the idea that they need to follow the rules, basically, with respect to everybody else, even if they don't get their way. And that's the big deal, right? That you're not going to go and bomb a federal building or something like that just because you didn't get your way in an election. But you're allowed to believe whatever crazy thing you want to believe.
Right. Religious or not.
Yes, religious or not, exactly. But none of them make that kind of argument, because the fact is, to me, this is what I mean by preaching to the converted, is that for someone who is basically a scientific rationalist, everything they say, all of them already believe. I mean, I can't imagine any of it would be convincing to somebody who was a fundamentalist, Christian, Mormon.
Most of it I don't think is even accurate. I mean, the characterizations of why people commit violence, for instance, by Harris, this idea that religious beliefs are the prime movers, I don't think is true. So, for instance, if you have a population of over 1 billion Muslims, you're supposed to be a scientist, and you're making the claim that religion causes violence, then you would have to explain why the percentage of people who commit violence in the name of religion is so minuscule. It's not something he tries to explain.
Yeah, but part of the problem there is simply that the border between religion and politics gets smeared out in this. And so it becomes almost impossible. When you have a religious disposition that means you ought to rule, then it becomes impossible to separate whether you're talking politics or talking religion.
And also, it's very hard to separate personal motivations. I mean, another one of Harris's points is that why would someone who has no obvious psychological dysfunction or, you don't need obvious psychological dysfunction for someone to be personally motivated, say the way Muhammad Atta was. He's the leader of the 9/11 attacks. If you've seen any biographies of him, you see certain personal patterns, which you see in a lot of the sorts of hopeless people who go and blow up other people. So there's a convergence of personal grievances, personal bitterness that gets tied into one's political grievances, and then religion can give you a sort of added license to push you over the edge. That's true, but to simplify it to saying that religion is the cause of these violent behaviors and nothing else is ridiculous, including, so for instance, Harris dismisses colonialism, which if there's any obvious reason why many Muslims are upset is because think about it, the United States were occupied and bombed and all sorts of those things. You don't think people would be committing political violence? And you don't think religion would be amped up and used for that political violence? I mean, it's absurd to say that colonialism isn't the cause.
Well, I would take Harris's argument as being in the way in which religion would leverage a certain kind of call to authority as making it more persuasive than the kind of buy-in that you would have either in traditional liberal democracy or a kind of rational argument, is that you immediately, if you have people convinced or you have a group of people who are willing to cede authority to people who say they speak to God or have authority in that way, then the kinds of justifications you need are no longer reasonable.
Those ideologies get amped up in certain situations. So, for instance, German totalitarianism, Germans had been humiliated. They were in a very humiliating position. And after the Versailles Treaty, having to pay reparations and their economy was in shambles, there are lots of obvious reasons why some sort of totalitarian ideology that restored national pride would be appealing to Germans. So political groups commit violence, and for similar reasons, I think, to individuals, which is questions of identity and pride and in-group, out-group, paranoid fears of annihilation by some other, scapegoating, as with the Jews in Germany. And then whether or not you get some sort of totalitarian ideology or some sort of religious ideology attached to that to enable it, well, that's a question, and that sort of thing happens. But the ideology is not the prime mover there. There are more fundamental motivators to violence that will use whatever fuel they can, religious or otherwise, to do their work.
I reiterate my question. What exactly is the topic for this particular gathering tonight? Because you guys have already kind of started into arguments from specific guys, and as Dylan pointed out, the issues they're addressing are not new. It's not like there's never been religious violence before. It's not like there hasn't been persecution, et cetera, et cetera. So why, at this point in time, in this day and age, in the last, let's call it, decade, do you suppose that there's this movement that these four relatively smart and articulate guys and others like them have decided that they need to speak out and write books about how religion and belief in God is a bad thing? What do you suppose the event was that spawned that?
Seth, you're not asking a leading question, are you?
Yeah, no, explicitly, Sam Harris is a 9/11 thing, and that's why it has sold so well and why it captured a certain part of the public imagination, why it could be a success story for this not overly qualified academic at the time, and it's very passionately written and displays a good deal of hysterical anti-Muslim sentiment.
Yeah, just hysteria in general. I mean, it's just like the worst sort of rhetorical garbage that you could put on paper.
Well, don't Hitchens and Harris's books fall sort of in that category, both explicitly being sort of responses to 9/11, and then both Dennett and Dawkins, they have that both in time period and that sense, but they also clearly are part of fighting this fight in America against creationism and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the culture war is a big factor, and the fear
for those two in particular,
the right wing, the legitimate fear.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of the point. The leading question that I asked is that the response to 9/11 from those of us who were in the, let's call it the moderate rational camp, right? Regardless of whether or not we were theists, or it was easy for Christians to identify the enemy, so to speak, as Islam, and for this counter rhetoric and political movement to develop. So the rise of the Christian or fundamentalist right in the United States makes sense as a reaction to the rise of this fundamentalist faction in Islam. And to me, the culture war is kind of an offshoot of that. The challenge was for those of us who deplore what happened, but recognize, as Wes pointed out, that the vast majority of Muslims actually live in Southeast Asia and weren't involved in this. And this is very much a political colonial thing and has to do with money and lots of other things revolving around the Middle East. How do we respond to that? And as the environment became more and more polarized, it seems to me that somebody felt the need to speak up out of the middle and simultaneously condemn one side without aligning themselves with the other side. That seems to me to be kind of the motivation or the environment that was created, why you have all of this happening when it happens now. And these are different flavors of how to address that. Some, I suppose, more rhetorically entertaining than others, and some more rigorous in thought and scholarship than others.
Well, I think Dawkins, I'm not sure to the extent to which Dawkins is motivated by the Muslim question. He seems to be more concerned about the science versus faith culture war and the possibility of creationism being taught in schools and that sort of thing.
Right. You can see Harris's book as being directly a response to 9/11, but the other ones potentially being, oh, now there's this bandwagon. And Dawkins and Dennett, and I don't know about Hitchens so much, they're going to be publishing books regularly anyway. And so this is at the top of their minds.
Hitchens took a huge turn after. Hitchens was always very left-wing and Marxist, and after 9/11, at least on questions of foreign policy, took this very right-wing turn.
Who's the comedian that did that?
Dennis Miller.
Yeah, Dennis Miller.
He freaked out or something like that after.
Completely lost his mind.
Career suicide, yes.
I don't know. I think he has a talk show on some basic cable station.
He's talking about, he's on the Fox Comedy Network.
Yeah.
He's got like one show with Dennis Miller.
But he does seem to have lost his ability to make references the way he used to.
Yeah, he was great.
So political works, I wouldn't characterize this exactly as preaching to the choir, because I think it's preaching to people who don't really like religion, don't buy it, but maybe don't think about it that much, and trying to get them energized, trying to make them into the choir. So I remember this making the rounds. The first I heard of this was around the Casey family, my in-laws. A few of them had read it, and then actually I had gotten it for my dad at one point before I had read much of it. And just reading the first chapter or so myself at the time, this is 5 years ago or whenever, there was something liberating about it, that finally somebody is just saying, wow, this is just totally full of shit. Maybe I thought about that, but I was just kind of too nice to, I don't like conflict. I don't like to dwell on such things, but, maybe it's time to stand up and do something. That's the feeling at least.
Atheists unite.
Yeah, and there's the obvious political, I don't remember what the figure is, but that atheist is less likely to be elected to a public office higher than a homosexual of any stripe, of any minority group. There's a public relations problem. And if you're just humming along and think, why should you have to hide
So not improve
what you believe if you're running for office. It's less likely that your policies would be affected by your atheism than, say, your belief, if a politician might have this, that God is telling them directly what to do.
You have to say lots of stupid things to get elected to office, not just religious. I mean, is there anything that you can say that's not stupid in a debate? I mean, all sorts of patriotic bromides and...
You can merely be silent and polite on some things if you're taking the high road.
You're going to sound like Ron Paul. Yeah, the exception is Ron Paul, and you see where that gets him. I mean, someone actually speaks their mind and says what they believe.
I think Rick Perry's speaking his mind.
Yeah, well...
These fragment of mind. That's there.
All right, no. Calm down, audience. We're giving an objective intellectual assessment of these readings and the political issues involved.
Look, I'm willing to defend religion tonight because I think none of these arguments work. I think they're garbage, but give me a few little political sideswipes.
Let me say one of the things that came to mind when I was reading Harris's book that wasn't exactly about religion, but maybe sort of, I guess, a question of philosophy and psychology. And he has this long section, basically a kind of catalog of the Spanish Inquisition. And, I'd read stuff like this before, and I got kind of sick to my stomach just thinking about it. And after I got over feeling sick to my stomach, I was left with wondering a lot about putting religion aside. There's something in the capability of human beings regarding the capability of cruelty, both in terms of totalitarianism and the need to inflict authority on others, as well as the need to inflict violence on others. And very, very personal violence. I mean, not necessarily international violence, but just seeing other people suffer. Whether it be public executions or whether it be individual torture events, and putting aside whatever motivations there are, the fact is that is a capability and a possibility within human beings that comes out in all sorts of circumstances. And even if you don't consider it normative, if you consider it aberrant in some ways, the mere fact is that it's possible. And I find it, I don't know if astounding, but yeah. I found myself distracted by the mere fact of possibility of the pleasure that other human beings have in both the subjugation of each other as well as the infliction of harm. And part of this was I know it myself. Look, I like winning. And I enjoy being in a competition, and I have certainly felt the desire to beat somebody. And I mean that in the sense of being victorious over them and have them be incapable of not submitting to my will by force. I've pinned people in wrestling, right? And they couldn't get up. And I also know just from raising kids, the need to have them obey what you say and how easily that slips into the need to have them think what you want them to think. Have the right kind of attitude. And all of those are seeds to me of the need to say, you need to think the way is the right way to think. I'm not saying that it's necessarily perverted, but the seeds of it that I have in my own experience, I can see a straight line to the way it can get perverted. And I just found myself wondering about how is that connected to the rest of our intellect and consciousness, that possibility exists in our mental activity.
Well, I think we already established in the feminine discussion that that's just because you're aberrant. It's too much testosterone.
Dude, you beat me to the punch. I was going to say, well, it's clear you didn't grow up in her land. But Dylan raises a very important point that I think we have to address here, right? So I think it's pretty safe to say that none of these works are pointing themselves at Buddhism. Or Hindu, a little maybe at Hinduism, I don't know, but not Confucianism.
Hitchens has a chapter, There Is No Eastern Solution, where he pretty much rips on all those guys as frauds. But
also, Buddhist monks, can engage in violence. There are riots and all sorts of shit that goes down when Buddhist monks go crazy.
But they're clearly, for the most part, targeted at the three major monotheistic religions of the West. And part of the reason why that's the case is that whether it's in the texts or not, all three of those religions have within them the thread that permits some kind of interpretation where some fundamentalist faction decides that the truth of that religion needs to be imposed upon others. In the case of Christianity, right, it's conversion. In the case of Islam, it's obeying Islamic law. And in the case of Judaism, it has to do with the imposition of some sort of political will on an offending minority. So the monotheistic Western religions have within them this absolutist ideology that brings out, as Wes said, these characteristics and amplifies them, as Dylan pointed out, and that it's this thing which drives all of the behaviors that are motivating this need to speak out.
I think that you could say it about any group ideology, and this brings us back actually to Rousseau and Hegel. I mean, there are deep-seated psychological needs to have other people share your values, because our, let's say, psychical existence isn't just predicated upon physiological needs, it's predicated upon what Hegel might call the recognition from the other. And I think Rousseau says something pretty close. It's when we reach the type of self-consciousness which sort of takes as its food a certain type of recognition from others that we begin demanding that recognition and responding violently when we don't get it. And a deviation in someone's values from your own is a threatening withdrawal of recognition. And so you get that Hegelian life-death struggle. And we could go on at length about those sorts of reasons that groupthink is demanded. But I don't think religion, religion, of course, is the most significant form of that. I don't think it's the only manifestation of that deeper psychological reason.
It seems like you're arguing in general against the power of ideas, and it's a very Freudian, perhaps cynical kind of theory of human behavior, that we have an innate aggressiveness and it needs to be channeled in certain ways. And here's religion. That's one of the ways it can be done. And it's going to happen sort of whatever your culture is and whatever your religion is. And it's going to adapt. First of all, it seems to deny the obvious power in history, I think, that ideas have had, right? And it could be the idea of socialism. It could be the idea of liberty. Yes, people flock to these things and fight wars over them because they have the capacity for being violent in the first place. Yes, of course. But whether that's going to go off at a given time, I mean, you can't just look at all of history and say there was sort of there was a pretty steady level of violence through all of it. Like, no, there really was, say, the disagreements between Protestantism and Catholicism that had the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War. There were some big things that were centered around ideas. And whereas, maybe in a place where the ideas don't give rise to that kind of thing, where the ideology is more neutered, then you're going to get individuals having fights and things, but they're not going to all join together in a massive all-out war.
I think that would be plausible if most wars were religious, and if most religious wars were religious.
Again, I'm not even saying religion yet. I just mean ideological.
So, for instance, during the Crusades, Christian armies went off and plundered Christian cities. Were they behaving based on their religious ideology primarily there? I mean, those questions become very complex. But I agree. You're right. I'm not denying the power of ideas. But I think those social constructions are predicated upon basic facts about the human psyche, and I think we could say the prevalence of violence through human history in all its various forms, religious and otherwise, political and otherwise, provides us with plenty of evidence that religion isn't unique in its status for being a reason for violence.
See, I don't impose that reading that it is unique onto Harris.
Harris explicitly makes that in the first two chapters of his book. He explicitly says that if you took away religion and people behaved solely based on evidence, all of these ills would go away. That's his explicit argument.
Okay, then let's make it better if that's what he says. Let's talk about the theory here that if there are beliefs that you hold not based on evidence, and I'm talking about not abstract beliefs that we were discussing in our last episode on whether the ultimate ground of being is a personality-less, some of the even theological things are not going to have these immediate political ramifications. But if you believe that anybody that does not share my belief, my scripture commands me to kill them, or they are not included in my moral community, so it's okay for me to kill them, would you not think that people's behavior might not be affected by that?
Yeah, but those sorts of reasons arise in the in-group, out-group thing will seize upon any number of reasons. It could be family, it could be tribal, it could be national. People in the United States, you can be guaranteed that if you make a joke about the French, people will immediately understand there's an underlying hostility for the French. Why? Who knows? but they are other. They are other in a
we
certain
don't want
kind
to
of way
kill
that
the
makes them.
Yeah, but Wes, I think you're discounting or at least minimizing too much the possibility of ceding the authority that is explicitly part of many religions regarding these kinds of decisions. You know, if we tried to do what Mark says and tried to see what the seed of Harris's argument is that has some more force, it would have to do with the way religion has the possibility intrinsically, or he would be making the argument that monotheistic religion in particular, and the way Judaism and Islam and Christianity have in their structure a disposition with respect to authority that allows for them to be perverted in a way that rational scientific discourse doesn't.
I don't agree. Even the concept of democracy, right, is used routinely to justify violence, right? We went over to Iraq to help people out with some democracy. It cost maybe 1 million or more lives, but we were trying to help them out with democracy.
Yeah.
I think democracy was actually written on the bombs. That it would...
If you look at, say, the Maoist uprising in China and Stalin in Russia, two explicitly atheistic movements that killed millions and millions of people, it's a tremendous piece of counter-evidence to the idea that there's something unique about religion. Now, if you want to say, well, okay, then anything that's totalitarian is just religion, okay, good. That's a neat way to try and win your argument. But I think given those bits of counter-evidence, it's very difficult to say that religion is unique in that aspect of encouraging violence and getting people to succumb to authority and groupthink.
So if I cede that point, religion is not unique. The question is it inherent in the concept of the 3 monotheistic Western religions, at least, that this urge to totalitarianism or imposition of some kind of truth or will on others through violence is inherent in the structure? That was what I was thinking I was hearing from Dylan.
I think it's inherent in any set of values to try and get other people conform, including, these books are examples. They're vitriolic. They're not violent, obviously. But the authors have a tremendous stake in getting other people to believe what they want them to believe, even when their positions are patently unreasonable. And they're masquerading as reason. So that irony in of itself should show you...
I think I agree. I think I would ask that we try to paint a few shades of gray, though, before we just say any idea or any system of values has inherent in it the need to impose that set of values on people that don't share it through violence.
Yeah, that's simply just not true.
No, I didn't say through violence.
Then that's a huge deal, right?
That's the whole target of the thing.
No, it's not the whole target, because there's a whole range of possibilities going from persuasion to violence. The whole point is that people are motivated to get others to believe what they want, whether through persuasion or violence.
So it's human nature. You guys brought this up in the Churchland episode, didn't you? That we have a desire for people to share our beliefs or share our values, our point of view, that there's a neurochemical...
Absolutely. You can see Hegel in any pick of a book on language acquisition and the role of joint attention and the role of joint attention in the development of infants. The sharing of, say, taking pleasure in some third thing or having the same value about some third thing is the fundamental glue of the social. I could be wrong, but I'm saying there's lots of good arguments to be made here. It's not some sort of radical, unheard of position.
No, I'm granting it. What I'm asking then is, so you just basically accuse these guys of engaging in the same activity just through rhetoric as opposed to suicide bombing. It's the same fundamental...
When you say it like that, it makes me sound like a blogger.
Well,
in my case right now, obviously, I have a stake in trying to persuade others. It's important to me that, I have this position and I think I'm right about it, and so it becomes important to me to share it. I'm not indifferent to other people sharing my position. I likely stop communicating. But the point is that, is there something that makes religion go to the next level and with violence, as opposed to persuasion? There's a case to be made, obviously, that religion is unique in some sense in going...
I'm just trying to get enough of Harris's view out before we just talk over him completely, which is just pointing to specific passages in scriptures and saying, look, if you take this literally, it is saying go out and kill all non-believers or other justifications of violence. In the Old Testament, where it says similar things.
The Old Testament is largely about race. It says go out and kill these people of certain races.
Yes.
There's nothing by Einstein that says go out and kill people who don't believe in the space-time continuum. That's not anywhere in there.
Right. I didn't say that all beliefs involve the implicit advocation of violence. That wasn't my position.
So it's a non-controversial point that he's arguing that if you take these particular passages in these various scriptures, literally, they're asking you to do bad things. Now, on top of that, he's arguing then that moderates are just failing to live up to the letter of their scriptures, and that sort of, if they had the guts to do what they set out to do, then they would be extremists. So there's something wrong with the moderates, that being a moderate is just kind of wussing out from the challenge that your religion through these scriptures is posing toward you.
That's if you think it's that sort of text.
Yeah, exactly. That's an amazingly naive view.
Yeah. It's more like literature or poetry.
Harris would respond that lots and lots of people, even if you protest that, oh, it's crazy to think that that is literal. I mean, there's a guy in the paper who's expanding his creationist museum in Tennessee or Kentucky or whatever. He already has a theme park dedicated to creationism, and he's building a life-size replica of Noah's Ark. And this guy is, just reading through, I believe he's utterly sincere. He is a fundamentalist in the way that he says, look, the Bible is just true, line for line. Now, he surely also commits the fallacy of picking and choosing, because he's not going out and, killing people and spreading the blood of lambs across his doorway and stuff like that. He's not doing that, right?
Yeah, he also didn't bother to learn Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek.
Yes, I agree. But the fact that they pick and choose and show that kind of inconsistency doesn't mean that they aren't fundamentalists. That just means they're inconsistent fundamentalists.
There's nothing inherently wrong with that inconsistency. If I say this, the scripture is meant to be taken literally in some places and metaphorically in others, it's an error in logic.
If you want to have the argument about how fruitful is it to take some of these things non-literally, very specific injunctions to kill all homosexuals or whatever the thing is that you're pointing at, what is the non-literal way to take something like that? And I guess none of these guys really dwell on that question, so I don't think it's one we should dwell on, but that's the response. It's hard to consistently hold. Certainly there are some parables and things where you can say, oh, okay, or we could have this whole discussion about, as Kierkegaard does, of Abraham being commanded to kill his son and things, and maybe get something fruitful out of that. But there at least seem to be, and again, you could point to these same ones that Harris brings up, these passages that it seems hard to come up with a metaphorical interpretation. It has to be a matter of, we're just going to ignore this part.
I have to disagree strongly with that. There's an alternative to ignoring or reading it metaphorically, and that is taking the attitude that the text is a basis for interpretation and that it's a guide that has to be interpreted and reinterpreted over time, which, by the way, is what Jews do, right? So there's a ton, in the same way that there's a ton in, at least I'm sure, certainly in Christianity and also in Islam, but there's a ton of commentary, scriptural commentary by religious figures. But in the Jewish tradition, that commentary itself becomes kind of part of the text, if you will. And the assumption was that the text was given, but once it's given, it contains, if you actually believe that it's given by God, it's the Word of God, and it's intended to guide our lives for the last 2,500 years or whatever it is, then you damn well better be able to metaphorically interpret and extract meaning out of the text that is not there. Because there's nothing in the Bible about how to deal with cell phones, for example, or sexting, or things like that. This is why the one thing I always get frustrated when people say Judeo-Christian, or all these guys are Christian writers who, at least some of them acknowledge that they're speaking specifically from a Christian point of view. I don't know, maybe Harris is Jewish, but there is a way to approach the text that you can say, well, that might have been valid at the time it was spoken, but we as a society or we as a group are not adhering to it now because it's not valid right now.
And interestingly, it sounds like you're coming directly against another part of Harris's thesis on that, which is that people who are moderates are not moderates because of anything internal to the religion. They're moderates because they have been influenced by modernity in some way, and they realize it would be absolutely freaking crazy to go along with some of the commands as stated verbatim. Whereas you're saying right there back in the tradition, part of the religion itself is that it's open to revision in light of subsequent experience and cultural wisdom.
Absolutely. Once the Jews were in the diaspora, they had to deal with the fact that a huge number of the commandments that are in the Bible relate specifically to the fact that there has to be a temple in Jerusalem where they can make sacrifices. So how do you follow the covenant with God if a third of what you're supposed to do you can't do?
And you could draw similar, why in Catholicism is there the political hierarchy that there was? It's to interpret the scripture for the lay people, and they have a strong feeling that this should be done consistently. So it's not just a matter of it being done by local parishioners, but things go right to the top, to the Supreme Court, as it were. Whereas in Protestantism, it's more about your individual relationship with God, or you and your pastor guiding you through these things. And there too, you can look at a model of Protestantism as giving you a way then to veto bad interpretations. And in fact, it's saying the only really optimal interpretations are going to be the ones that you yourself give, basing what you do, or you in association with your immediate religious community that you can discuss these things with. So it seems like at least those three, Judaism, Protestantism, and Catholicism, frankly, I just don't know enough about Islam to say whether there's the kind of flexibility in some breeds of that.
Part of it is that in all of these cases, maybe Wes brought this up earlier, is that most people who consider themselves believers, it's one part of their lives, and they get along and play well with others, by and large, pretty well for all of these religions. And that there are subsets of all of them that claim their religion as a central inspiration for most of their extreme views with respect to the rest of their community. So they're in a minority, but they often present very difficult political problems. I mean, it's not the case that, even creationism in the schools thing, it's never the case that it's a wave of protests that are coming banging on the doors with tens of thousands of people demanding that, a literal interpretation of the Bible be presented at the school. It's a very loud minority of people. Right? It's also not as if there are waves and waves and waves of thousands and thousands of people coming together and blowing themselves up at the foot of some Capitol building. It's far fewer than claim to be members of those faiths.
Now, before your final comment there about blowing up, I was about to say, it sounds like you've never lived in Texas.
Well.
Right, I was going to say that too, actually. I was going to say Texas is an exception, just to get myself in more trouble. But yeah, if you look at, say, the number of attacks, I don't know, there was some study on the number of attacks motivated by Islam versus right-wing non-religious ideologies, neo-fascism or something, in the United States, that those sorts of attacks far outnumber violence committed in the name of Islam.
Or for animal liberation.
Yeah, right. And then you look at there's a large Muslim community in the United States that is, with extremely rare exceptions, not engaging in terrorist attacks or planning or trying to.
If we're just going to engage the political question a little bit from Harris's point of view, what about this argument that he's making a criticism against moderates or against a kind of sloppy relativism that postmodern liberals engage in that allows them to enable extremism by not confronting it explicitly?
By saying we're not competent to judge it, yeah.
Yeah.
Or also by saying that the realms of science and faith fall into distinct realms, the non-overlapping magisteria, so that the standards of evidence are different for faith than they are for science.
He would pick the example of genital mutilation and how there would be a attempt amongst liberals to say this is part of their cultural heritage, yada, 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 so we don't have any business saying that it's wrong and preventing them from doing it. It's part of their faith or their cultural identity, and we can't be competent to judge that because it's outside the proper realm. And he would say, well, that's just total and utter horse shit. And he has, other arguments in other places about what you should be trying to make those rules with respect to.
Right. Obviously, he's right that, it's horse shit that we have to be relativists and not make a judgment about genital mutilation just because it's religious. But I think he's wrong. He's not aware of the Kantian history, genesis of this idea that faith and empirical science have these distinct realms, and empirical sciences don't have these negative consequences for faith that he might think. And so that, in some sense, judgments of faith are privileged. As we saw that William James thought that in a kind of similar way. I think he's rejecting that. He briefly sort of mentions that kind of idea and rejects that as well. That's where I think he's wrong.
I think Harris in particular and Hitchens, they're really aiming at low-hanging fruit. Whereas in the Dawkins book, he goes out of his way to talk about this non-overlapping magisteria, which he attributes to Stephen Jay Gould in a dispute between two intellectuals judging, does a theory of evolution, should that cause you to be an atheist? But Harris is concerned with these, is homosexuality an abomination such that all homosexuals need to be put to death right now? Is cat burning okay? He uses that example specifically. Certainly there are things that are part of religious creeds that are testable matters of fact or matters of history. You know, was Jesus a virgin birth is often thrown around. And so you could just say, like Schleiermacher or somebody like, of course we thought that was just a symbolic or something. We don't actually believe that. And really the stuff that's the heart of religion is not something contradicted by science. But that's really not, I think, what the target of their kind of religion, right? They're targeting a religion that God answers prayers and there are miracles and all these things that really do have testable empirical consequences, right?
Well, I think there are three different levels, right? There's the sort of abstract and personal God who might as well just be the universe and you might as well not call it God sort of thing. And then there's the minimal God. I think minimally we have to think about God not just as a creator of the universe, but as an intentional being, a person, let's say, for it to have any real power. And then you get into the specific God of different religious faiths and whether or not that God intervenes and answers prayers and violates the natural order by intervening with miracles. And that's the more extreme version. I think that the second two are both targets. So for instance, Dawkins' 747 argument and so on, he's at a level of generality where he's just talking about a personal God. He's not worried specifically about the Christian God. Because conceivably we could reject the concept of miracle and the concept of a God that intervenes and still believe in a God that's a sentient person who cares, let's say.
But I guess that's why I characterize the question for this episode as overall, should we be religious? And of course, there are any number of ways of being religious, but the way in which the targets of these authors would interpret that is in the strong way, is in having faith in these. You could just argue with their characterizations that no, most believers don't actually believe in the literal truth of the virgin birth or something like that. And then it becomes a matter of statistics and, we polled all these people and a lot of them really do believe that. And they really do believe the earth is 6,000 years old. And, it becomes much less interesting in a way.
Yeah, I tend to agree with them. And we probably all agree with them in rejecting miracles and an interventionist God. And for those,
I don't think most people do, though.
There are good atheistic arguments against the idea of an interventionist.
I guess one question would be, does it matter that most people do believe in an interventionist God, regardless of what faith they have?
Yeah, they're shit out of luck. But there are plenty of theologians, for instance, who will take a more highfalutin view without completely jettisoning the personal God. So that's probably the most interesting middle way against which that's something that Dawkins' arguments would be relevant to. Dawkins' arguments aren't so weak that they only apply to some god of, say, the Christian faith who's responsible for miracles. So they apply at that more sophisticated level where theologians are trying to save the concept of God.
Well, it seems like we've moved on to Dawkins' main argument. There's part of chapter 2 where he brings up this non-overlapping magisteria and he's criticizing agnosticism specifically. And he wants to claim, since he's a writer on matters of evolution, biology and such, he's going to be concerned with primarily what Robert had identified in our last episode as the most persuasive argument for the theologically minded that were open to arguments that he was aware of, which is the argument from design. And that really the only way that you would buy this is if you just don't really understand the theory of evolution. You don't understand natural selection. And so I'd say most of what Dawkins writes is an attempt to popularly explain natural selection such that you will agree with him that, okay, I guess it might look like that watch was designed, that the eye must have had a conscious designer, but that's just a misinterpretation of the theory. So anyway, he's arguing that as a whole, the hypothesis that a god created the universe as opposed to blind chance or natural selection is an empirical claim, right? That even though it would be very hard to test, and we'd have to think very hard about how to test it, it should have empirical consequences that there is a designer. And so he would point to things like, if you really thought that God was designing everything, well, wouldn't everything be designed very efficiently? You wouldn't have these leftovers from other evolutionary periods and these vestigial organs and things sitting around. Like if you're going to say, look, I see in the beauty of this that there is design, then you have to look closer at it and say, yeah, okay, there's a lot of, why is it done that way? Wouldn't it be much simpler if, like, we weren't bugged by allergies the way we are? Or AIDS, or many sort of flaws in our genetic design or the design of various animals we run into.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a reason to be skeptical that God created we can all reject the intelligent design argument in terms of explaining what we know that evolution explains, right? So more interesting is the cosmological design argument where all the constants are just right, such that for the development of life and human beings, and if they were off just a little bit, none of that would have happened.
So page 157 in his book, which is the end of chapter 4, Why There Almost Certainly Is No God, he says, this chapter has contained the central argument of my book. So he's going to summarize it as a series of 6 numbered points. Let me just go through those, see if we have anything to say about this. Number 1, one of the greatest challenges to the human intellect over the centuries is to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. 2, the natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. In the case of a man-made artifact such as a watch, the designer really was an intelligent engineer. It is tempting to apply the same logic to an eye or a wing, a spider or a person. 3, the temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. The whole problem we started out with was the problem of explaining statistical improbability. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable. Well, let's comment on that. I know we already addressed that a little in our last episode, but the idea that saying God is the cause of all this doesn't explain anything because contra, and he brings up Swinburne specifically, who we talked about last time as having this belief in God as ultimately simple. Look, it's just this simple, pure infinity that has all the powers. For something to actually have the attributes that Swinburne attributes to it, which is not just designing things, but in fact holding everything in place at all times. For that, something as mind-bogglingly complex as that to be called simple is just crazy. That no, you would need, far from putting God there to answering the question, it actually raises an even greater question of how do you explain God in some way.
When I think about this problem, I always am brought back to, if you buy the idea that there can be things that are made of smaller parts as a result of their mutual interactions with one another, period, then why would you need to have a designer to hold it all together? If you grant at all that there is any kind of activity such that the mutual activities result in a new activity, that might be where you say, oh, that's just not true. There's no such thing as two activities interacting with one another to make something genuinely new, and you don't buy that. But if you do buy that, then there's no reason to believe that a larger whole that has articulations and features that weren't part of the underlying pieces is just an utterly natural thing, utterly possible.
Yeah, I think Dylan, you're getting at what we saw with the Mackie. Is it really the sort of point of agreement between theists and non-theists is that there's some necessary being, meaning some being or beings, where the chain of causes or chain of explanations comes to an end. In other words, it's uncaused. And so whether those are the ultimate particles, let's say, or whether we want to think of that as the universe itself, non-theistic explanation, or whether we want to go the theistic route and say that we need some explanation of God is the question. Now, the theists, of course, give their own explanations of why we need to go to the extra step of God. Some of those arguments have to do with the idea that if everything in the universe is contingent, the universe as a whole is contingent and can't be a necessary being, whether you buy that. I mean, for me, it's a fuzzy thing either way. Another argument is that God supplies a simpler explanation. God is meant to be ultimately simple, and God is also an intentional explanation. And the more traditional point is that God is in some sense self-explanatory. I think modern theists to some extent aren't as keen on this exactly. I think they more take the route that God is in no need of explanation. But the idea is how to tie up your explanatory chain and whether or not you need to leave it at the world just is and that's it, or go the extra step of saying there's a God. I think either way, you're leaving things essentially mysteriously. In other words, in either way, you're saying at some point we say the principle of sufficient reason no longer applies.
I don't think that those are the only two options, because in the theist case, you say, well, okay, look, you've come to this conclusion that you have uncaused causes and therefore you're going to postulate the cause of God. In the other case, as you characterized it, you have uncaused causes and you just say, oh, those things exist. But I think that you have to say a little bit more about that and a little bit more about why you've gotten yourself into that corner. And one of the reasons you've gotten yourself into that corner, it seems to me, is that you've assumed that anything that has a being has no activity at all, no intrinsic activity, that it just is. But if it just is, then you're right. You have no motion to attribute to it, so it can't have any cause. But if the things that are fundamental, that are at the bottom, have as part of their being intrinsic activity, then they have activity of their own proper to them.
Well, you're just postulating some self-caused ultimate natural beings. You're still postulating necessary beings that have no external cause. I mean, you can add to that, well, they're self-caused because they have...
No, I'm not saying they're self-caused.
Their own inherent activity.
Well, no, I don't know if I want to call that self-caused.
Look, the assumption at work here is the principle of sufficient reason, which is generally what we apply in scientific inquiry, which is to say that we expect any phenomena to have some cause. Now, at some point, right, that does have to break down. At some point, we reach an end to that chain of explanations or chain of causes. Or it goes on infinitely, which I think there are good reasons to think it doesn't.
Part of this, to me, depends upon how you want to interpret quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. Some people will say, well, look, quantum mechanics can't be the end of the story because it does exactly what you just said. It doesn't present a cause for these activities of these fundamental particles.
Well, quantum mechanics doesn't say that some event doesn't have any
absolutely it
prior
does.
Cause. It just says that the cause isn't sufficient to...
Wes, absolutely it does. There's no cause to radiation happening at the particular time that it happens.
Just to inject, Dylan has a physics PhD for listeners that were not aware of that. I'm not telling you, I'm telling
I've read the physics debates on this. I don't think the common interpretation for the quantum mechanics is that it simply does away with cause altogether. The usual interpretation is that it says that the cause isn't sufficient, but it's necessary. It doesn't mean that there's no cause at all.
I'm not saying that there aren't causal events. What I'm saying is that within quantum mechanics, things just happen as part of their intrinsic activity. The boiling of the vacuum, the happening of radiation. There isn't a physicist out there that can tell you when radiation is going to happen. They can tell you on average when it's going to happen.
What do you mean when radiation is? I mean, when I turn on the light, radiation doesn't happen.
When a particular particle radiates out when an electron radiates a photon, or when a uranium nucleus is going to decay.
But that doesn't mean there's no causal theory of nuclear decay. You're just talking about indeterminacy. It means that the causes aren't going to determine a specific effect. They're going to determine a probability range.
Yeah.
That in itself, I don't think, is a violation of the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason doesn't require you to be a determinist. It just has to mean that there is some causal structure to the chain of events. Even if I can't say when the radiation is specifically going to happen, I don't think of it as uncaused.
Well, I guess it depends upon, we're going to get into a discussion about what you mean by cause. Maybe I'm just unsophisticated about what it means by the principle of sufficient reason and what that says about the notion of a fundamental entity having its own activity versus not having its own activity.
When you say it has its own activity, I take that to mean that it doesn't need an external cause, right?
I mean, something else made it do that. Yes, I guess that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like you're making a case for a necessary natural being, a being with no cause outside of itself. Maybe the word necessary being kind of throws it a little bit, but we're just talking about a being which needs no external cause.
To me, an argument that's a little bit stronger that says that all entities have as part of their being activity, whether they're big beings or little things or small things, all the way down. Mm-hmm. That to speak of something being a being without speaking of its activity doesn't make any sense at all.
But for most macroscopic beings, when we say West behaves in this certain way or some planet's revolving around another, we would expect to be able to causally take that apart.
Can somebody just remind me where we are? Like why
we're at number 3 on page 158 of the Dawkins book regarding the question of statistical improbability and the designer hypothesis.
Although really you guys have jumped to 4 and 5 as well.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that the discussion was still somehow related.
Yes. Let me just read 4 and 5, and so we'll be caught up, and then we'll be nearly done. There's only 6 of them. So number 4, the most ingenious and powerful mechanism so far discovered is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Darwin and his successors have shown how living creatures, with their spectacular statistical improbability and appearance of design, have evolved by slow, gradual degrees from simple beginnings. We can now safely say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that, an illusion. All right, and then here's the hard part. Number 5, we don't yet have an equivalent crane for physics, an equivalent mechanistic explanation that is gradual, that is. Some kind of multiverse theory could in principle do for physics the same explanatory work as Darwinism does for biology. This kind of explanation is superficially less satisfying than the biological version of Darwinism because it makes heavier demands on luck. But the anthropic principle entitles us to postulate far more luck than our limited human intuition is comfortable with. So that's the idea that, as Wes was referring to, even if we grant Darwinian natural selection, still evolution would only occur. We would only have life at all if we had a very careful combination of environmental conditions in the universe.
6 constants.
Yes.
A physicist named Rees, I think, said that.
And so one of the ideas thrown around is, well, maybe there are multiple universes, in fact, where all those are instantiated, and we just happen to be in the one that it all lines up. And that's why we're talking now. That's the anthropic principle. So if you ask, oh, life is so improbable, isn't it crazy that there's life here? Well, that doesn't really work because maybe there is no life anywhere else. It's just we are the one among billions and billions and billions and billions of planets that has it, but we're the ones who are talking about it. So, of course, we have to take that for granted, however improbable it might have been beforehand. Its antecedent improbability should not convince us that there has to have been a designer because maybe it really is that improbable. So the question is, can you take that same sort of argument and apply it to universes? And it seems less satisfying, he's saying.
The multiverse isn't a widely accepted theory.
Right.
So.
It's a pretty ad hoc, like really we have to believe that there are literally multiple universes and this is the one that, you know,
especially if its sole reason is to win the argument and there isn't empirical.
One thing that's funny about that argument to me, it's clearly a desperate search of a denominator. You're desperately searching for the denominator of your probability so that you can have instantiated in the whole. You're going to say we have our one case, but in order to have the universe be a whole, we have to have the actual presence over time of all the other possibilities. So I have this explosive number of universes because I need to have a whole, a particular whole, which is funny to me because that simply isn't taking the lesson from Darwin's natural selection argument, in which you don't have this whole. It's not the case that you have every possible being has been created and then the ones that exist, there's somehow a probability associated with them. That's not how it works. There might be probability.
I think we're confusing some different. I mean, at the cosmological level, there are some very fine-tuned constants, right? Without which life would be impossible.
Sure.
And they can't vary even by the tiniest fraction, none of the 6 constants. Otherwise, the universe would simply not even achieve this level of order, much less life.
Right. So we would have to make, for this analogy to work, earlier when he's talking about how people will point to, look, the eye, that's so complex. It's illimitably complex. Like, how could that have evolved? Because you can't have half an eye. What good would that be to somebody? And he says, well, actually, think about what happens with your eye if you kind of mostly cover it up. Then maybe you can only perceive light and dark. But that would still be a tremendous survival advantage. So actually, half an eye works pretty darn well. And so it's really not like magically producing this thing from nothing. It's a matter of kind of like the children's game, warmer or colder. You know, something gets stumbled upon and like, oh, that's warmer. And then so it's going further in that direction, that it really is much easier to understand how a whole could be created in that way. Now, can you make any kind of parallel argument like that about these 6 universal factors that are required for the universe to sustain life? I mean, you can't have the temperature is getting toward where it would be.
Yeah.
What temperature and gravity? I don't even know. We should at least characterize them.
You have to look it up.
I just don't even know what I'm talking about here, so it's hard for me to.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that whole discussion was presented as a possibility, but we didn't read anything about how that argument actually works. Dawkins presented that possibility.
Kenny gives a good refutation of the anthropic principle.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. In fact, I didn't introduce this reading. So Wes had run across this book by Anthony Kenny, who's a Wittgenstein scholar, right? The whole book is called From Empedocles to Wittgenstein, Historical Essays in Philosophy. The specific essay that we were concerned with, that we all read, was Knowledge, Belief, and Faith, which is chapter 14 of the book. The book is from 2008. In that, he responds specifically to Dawkins, and he says, look, I agree with 90% of what Dawkins has to say. Like, he's not a theist or anything like that.
He's making an argument for agnosticism.
We can talk a little more about Kenny, but what he has to say about here.
Really, Dawkins is confusing two versions of the anthropic principle. One is just a completely bogus idea that if we take the universe as unique and those 6 constants are finely tuned, the idea is, well, we can't say, oh, that's odd that the universe is finely tuned to produce life, and if those constants varied by just a little bit, it wouldn't. We couldn't ask that question if those constants weren't just finely tuned in that way. That anthropic principle is completely bogus. So, for instance, if we're lined up in front of a firing squad of 1,000 people and they all miss us, we say, oh, I wonder how is that's very improbable that they all missed us. Well, we can't ask that question because we wouldn't be here to ask it if they hadn't all missed. It's a complete non sequitur. It mistakes the idea that it's necessary that they miss for you to ask that question with the necessity of them missing. So the other way Dawkins tries to use the anthropic principle is by introducing multiverses, which would be legitimate if you had any evidence from the multiverse.
Well, you do have like Spock with a beard. That's evident.
What?
Those sci-fi stories where like the Star Trek episode
the
where you go
universes?
where you go through the transporter and your evil doppelganger comes out from the alternate universe. It's interesting since we're talking about Kenny here. I think he ends up distinguishing at the end. These guys are not giving an argument against the belief in God. What they're arguing against is religious faith, which is an incommensurability between the evidence you have for something and the certainty with which you follow it. So all these things we're saying about, oh, well, you can't be sure that there is no God, or really, right, Dawkins is not saying we can be sure there is no God, but he says there is room for probability. Contra the agnostic, you can still, because of these difficulties he's raised with how complex God is and how that would require explanation, that's almost certainly, it's very likely that is not the case. Whereas the strict agnostic says, we just can't apply probabilities to this at all. I think Kenny is going to follow that Kantian critique. His probabilities is inappropriate here. But given that, are you then justified in acting upon a principle as if you know it for a certainty when you don't, right? Where the point of faith is you don't know it for a certainty. Maybe you have reasonable grounds, but then you make the extra leap and you take it for a certainty. And I think Kenny even agrees, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, that there's something morally objectionable in that. I mean, he gives some examples from Wittgenstein.
Yeah, there are all sorts of examples of things we believe without evidence. So, for instance, the Wittgenstein example is that the Earth has existed for many past years.
Yes.
Well, that's actually sort of inductive argument. That's not something we have direct evidence for. The list of those sorts of things goes on and on, that other people have minds, that we were born, so on and so forth.
Well, most things are like that, right? Almost nothing we encounter, we have evidence for.
Exactly.
So he brings up Plantinga again as a guy that says belief in God is like that. And Kenny disagrees.
Yeah.
He thinks belief in God is reasonable only if it is based on considerations available to all humans, not if it is claimed based on the basis of a special message to oneself or to the group that one belongs to.
So the failure of the arguments for the existence of God doesn't mean that they don't provide some reasons for believing in God. They're not evidence in the strict sense of empirical evidence, but they still constitute reasons for believing in God. Then you're left in a situation where there's no way to intellectually get to the conclusion of the argument. So we're left in that William James position where...
Right. Kenny quotes him specifically, or refers to the same thing, right? That there's a happy medium in what we should believe. If we have too strict standards of efforts, then we're going to miss out on believing things that we really should. It would be better for us to buy into. But if we're too sloppy and accept any old thing people tell us, then we're falling short as well.
Yeah. And with the William James will to faith, thing that we read quite a while ago, his idea was that if we have a lived, forced, momentous option to believe or not to believe the proposition, and it can't be decided on intellectual grounds, then it's permissible to decide us on the basis of our passional nature instead of on the basis of evidence. So if we go through all these arguments for and against the existence of God and we don't think it really tips the scales either way, you say, well, actually, intellectually, we can't say either way. So then it becomes purely a matter for one's quote-unquote passional nature.
So when it comes to the claim that it is immoral to act in a stronger way based on a proposition than grounds you have for believing in it, well, that can't be immoral in all cases, but it does seem to be a significant challenge, particularly if the action is extreme, right? If I think that I need to blow up the world based on something I heard in a dream.
Yeah, Kenny says it's the degree of commitment involved in faith that can be the problem, not the commitment itself.
So in that sense, it's, Kierkegaard's leap of faith. It is the problem. That all this, the kind of thing that Swinburne is doing is within the grounds of reason. And he's looking at the evidence that doesn't tell us for sure either way. And he says, well, you gotta live your life. But if it takes you to extremes that would violate ordinary morality, which is exactly the point with Kierkegaard, that your religion is beyond ordinary morality. It's just on a whole higher plane. So really, it seems to follow from that, even though, of course, this is not the way Kierkegaard acted or anything. If you take that prima facie, that you're going to be doing violent things based on insufficient evidence, which I think is ultimately, again, all these guys like Sam Harris are arguing against. It's just that they are so hyperbolic that they're trying to shout down anything that would enable that it's not just the actual ones showing the symptoms of this horrible disease. It's the bad habits that, allow the disease to flourish in the first place, I guess is an analogy for the way they're trying to approach it. So we read the last 3 chapters of Hitchens' God is Not Great, which I think is his big book of anecdotes. It's just like every horrible thing that he has heard about that somebody did in the name of religion is described in graphic detail. His target just seems to be organized religion. It's against enforced belief in silly stories, I think is a good way to characterize it, that there are things, again, like the virgin birth or whatever. And you can come up with many, many examples from all the different religions that are empirical or are making some historical claims. Most of these things about miracles and things like that. Freud has an atheism book, The Future of an Illusion, where he just looks at things like that and says, come on, aren't we more grown up than that as a civilization? Can't we just get beyond that? It's a little pathetic. So Hitchens is taking that, but having even more hostility towards organizations that then will shove those stories down your throat. Which again, this seems like such low-hanging fruit. Like, really? Are any of us going to argue in favor of totalitarian theocracies?
But, aren't there people that do make that argument? I'm not going to make that argument, but there certainly are people making those arguments, right? Or is it just a weasel out where you say, well, nobody's making the argument, they're just being totalitarian. There's no argument for totalitarianism. There's just being totalitarian. Is that the way you go?
Of course, though, one of the instruments of totalitarianism is persuading your people. That's part of, maybe they're not good arguments. Maybe you don't have to because they're so in your grip, but that's certainly one of the intentions of anybody who has that kind of political persuasion.
If you grant that history is rife with totalitarian regimes and even the modern world is rife with totalitarian regimes, and those regimes have arguments associated with them, be them bad even if they are, we can't say that there's no one out there that's going to make that argument. There's all kinds of people out there making that argument and all kinds of people believing that argument. And there have since the beginning of time, practically.
So does that mean there is a political useful purpose for a book like this, which I found of the 4, well, this and the Harris book, I had a really hard time just stomaching more than a few pages at a time.
No.
What, the Hitchens?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, pompous.
His style is kind of amusing, and if you're reading just a sassy blogger or something, like he's definitely a good writer.
Yeah.
I just wasn't interested when I was looking in this for philosophy and not just for something to read on the toilet or something.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm brought back to the fact that I don't think that either of these books were written to address the people that they were most arguing that were problems. Neither of these books are written towards totalitarians. Neither of them is going to convince a Mao Zedong or a Stalin or a Khomeini to stop doing what they're doing.
Maybe we better sketch out what his comparison that he makes in here, because it's not just against totalitarianism, but it's arguing that, as Wes said near the beginning of this, some of the worst dictators, Stalin is often brought up, are explicitly atheist. And the move then, which he makes here, is to say that totalitarianism has a religious origin. Your average king that just wants your fealty or wants your stuff, they don't care about your thoughts. Like, it's only when you get into a theocracy that you have thought crime, right? He has a quote from Orwell in there that says, a totalitarian state is in effect a theocracy. Whereas the book 1984, which everyone would associate with it, is not an overtly religious state or anything like that.
Well, he's using, theocracy in a loose sense, so.
Right. And I think this is what Harris, again, is arguing against. It's not just explicitly religious movements. It's any time that you have an unconsidered, faith-based, that's what unconsidered means according to the way he sets it up, devotion to something in particular such that you will do whatever it wants and let it control your life
like
and even kill for it.
Devotion to...
He's not going to kill for it. I think that's the crucial... Anyway.
The thing that I found persuasive, not persuasive, but the thing that I thought a nice way to think about it in Hitchens, and it's sort of a political argument, was the arrangement of totalitarianism as involving the imposition of impossible tasks and rules, and that you have tasks and demands that are made of you that are utterly impossible to accomplish, and therefore you're always guilty, and therefore your regime holds that over you all the time. And the perfect example would be the kind of thought crimes that you say, you are admonished from ever thinking X, Y, or Z. And so Hitchens would point to when you have commandments like thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. He would say, look, that's a thought crime. And the fact that you would have that be a rule in, be it a regime or a religion, it amounts to an impossible task because you are regulating your thoughts rather than your actions. And it seemed to me that that was one of the levers where a totalitarianism and the way it tries to regulate your thoughts is going to have something in concert with religion, in that you would have directives regarding not your behavior, but your actual thinking.
We should note here, by the way, though, that there are all sorts of social forces that command us to regulate our thoughts all the time. There are lots of taboo thoughts that we're not allowed to have. They change from time to time. So, for instance, it may not be illegal to be a racist, but there's a tremendous amount of social pressure against, and you're not going to see any writers at major newspapers just getting to go ahead to pen off racist diatribes. So it's not that those sorts of controls aren't there socially. It's just when they get lifted to the level of political enforcement. But I don't think we should delude ourselves that otherwise we're somehow free to have the thoughts that we want. Mark, you mentioned Harris not being willing to kill for it, but there are things in Harris that sound dangerous. Like, for instance, I hope to show that the very ideal of religious tolerance, born of the notion that every human being should be free to believe whatever he wants about God, is one of the principal forces driving us toward the abyss. Now, that may just be unfortunate phrasing, but I think it says something about Harris that he's suggesting that the idea that every human being should be free to believe is... The implicit idea is that that freedom should be curtailed. That's a totalitarian inclination.
Wait. The curbing of freedom is not a totalitarian inclination.
The idea that people should be free to believe.
Yeah, that part,
yes. We're talking about totalitarian thought control. And we have Harris saying that the freedom to believe whatever you want about God is a principle driving us towards the abyss. Now, he doesn't explicitly say that government should regulate that, but obviously he's lamenting the fact of that freedom.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see, subsequently, certainly my esteem for him went way down after that whole, he was one of the people speaking out against the mosque at Ground Zero. You had a blog post on that. So when it cashes out into actual political action against religious folks, it's a little ridiculous. I think Dawkins is much more explicit in what he wants politically out of this, right? He doesn't want special dispensation for, say, conscientious objectors in war who make it on religious grounds as opposed to those who make it on other grounds. He doesn't want special tax breaks for religious organizations as opposed to other organizations doing similar things. And, I agree for the most part. And Kenny mentioned in his article that he agrees with those practical upshots. And he also, when ordinary people, I've encountered this on internet forums and things, when they say, you're free to believe whatever you want, what that means is don't criticize me for whatever weird ass thing I say. Don't expect me to have reasons for things. So like in any philosophy class, in that sense, you're not free to believe anything you want. You have to have a justification for it, and you will be challenged if you don't have a justification for it. And there's a sort of a marketplace of ideas again, and that you are expected to have to, if you are being intellectually honest, then your ideas should have to compete in that.
Right. You see that all the time in politics with some political candidate when they're criticized, complaining that their freedom of speech is being curtailed because they're being criticized.
Yes.
It's ridiculous.
But you can see in practical terms, like if every time, say, I mentioned Dennett, you immediately, Wes, started talking over me so I could never get Dennett's views out, then that would be like you were curtailing his speech when, no, I'm exaggerating.
But I mean,
But that's, there are practical details of how much this is getting into just the issue of rights in general. I mean, do you really have a right to free speech if you really have no outlet at all to express that?
Yeah. And it goes towards what I was talking about social pressures, what candidate says they're going to be marginalized, that all the scorn is going to effectively prevent them from speaking their mind. Yeah. They're cashing in on that subtle distinction between the political enforcement and the social enforcement.
So again, it seems like there's a portion of Hitchens in particular, let's just say, ignoring Harris for the moment, that is saying, yes, he's a social commentator. He's H.L. Mencken, and he's pointing out this hypocrisy and then wrong things. And there's certainly something politically satisfying, if you agree with his basic point of view, and that this is a release of some sort, that being an atheist in this way and objecting to the low-hanging fruit again, which is all too easy to find if you're engaged in the political, if you're not just a philosopher trying to only read good books, if you're out there in the political world. So do these books serve a legitimate purpose then? Or are they really just the complete trash that, maybe they're just not, I'm not the target audience. I found the Hitchens boring and wouldn't read the whole thing. But maybe there are people who were raised in a strict religious tradition but are breaking away from it, and this will help them achieve a greater clarity of thinking and independence. And so, oh, great. Okay. Somebody needs this.
Well, it rallies the troops, right? As you mentioned before.
I'm not just saying it brings you to militancy. If something will make you more open-minded, better able to participate in this debate about these things, then it's not so bad. And there are lots of books that can achieve that are not aimed at me because I'm, that are aimed at somebody in a particular intellectual situation. Or does the vitriol that's in here completely counterbalance anything positive that might come out of these books?
Well, look at the way the debate is on the web. It's very vitriolic. And then you have these atheist clubs now, and you all wear like a spaghetti monster t-shirt and put up, I don't know. It seems to me that it's not encouraging people to be reasonable or think very deeply about these things. You have to slog through something like Mackie to do that, and that's not fun for a lot of people.
You brought up the spaghetti monster, the teapot. Do you want to talk about those? Bertrand Russell is the teapot example from Why I Am Not a Christian.
Originally, Bertrand Russell is objecting to this idea that faith, because it involves assertions that can't be disproved, somehow belongs to this special domain, and we ought to withhold judgment. So he uses this example, but I'll just quote Russell, it's very quick. If I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars there's a china teapot revolving about the sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion, provided I were careful to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed, even by our most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go on to say that, since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is an intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt it, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. If, however, the existence of such a teapot were affirmed in ancient books, taught as the sacred truth every Sunday, and instilled into the minds of children at school, hesitation to believe in its existence would become a mark of eccentricity and entitle the doubter to the attentions of the psychiatrist in an enlightened age or of the inquisitor in an earlier time. Dawkins repeats that argument, and one that's similar, the idea of this flying spaghetti monster, which was a guy who was protesting the teaching of creationism in schools, wrote up a very similar case where it just replaced the teapot with the flying spaghetti monster.
Right. Dawkins uses that to argue, though, that even though you can't know for sure there is no God, still probabilities apply. And that would be true if it was just as random an assertion as the flying teapot, the existence of God. But you can see in the discussion of the cosmological argument that we just had earlier here and on the previous podcast, God is not merely a placeholder that it's supposed to serve some ontological function that you might argue is bullshit and is not necessary, but it's not just completely random.
Yeah, and also not just that, but Russell chooses something that's inherently unlikely given what we know about physics. When we try and tell a story about how the teapot got into this orbit, we come to the conclusion that its existence is very unlikely. So he's using this argument to say, until we have evidence, the presumption is to say there's no such thing as a teapot. But that's actually, we're not doubting a teapot because of the absence of evidence. We're doubting it because it's inherently unlikely given our background knowledge. I think a better example would be, suppose someone suggested the possibility of some astronomical object, one consistent with physics, but for which there's no evidence, and we don't yet have the observational techniques to see it.
Black holes.
So if someone asks you whether they thought it was more likely that such objects existed or didn't exist, I think we'd have to say we would remain agnostics. We wouldn't say, well, the presumption is that they don't exist. So I think really, in the end, the best Russell can do with the teapot, if you take a less salacious example, is to say that absent the evidence, we should be suspending judgment.
Or the spaghetti monster. I was about to go in St. Anselm's version of the spaghetti monster proof, because in the ontological one, we had several versions of that last time that all amounted to basically the same thing.
Well, he shows there has to be 5 meatballs. And,
Are we ready for Dennett to cap it off, thereby repeating our Dennett treatment that we had in our Philosophy of Mind episode long ago, where we were already very far into the podcast and everybody was tired before we even started considering him. And so,
oh, poor Dennett.
I just like his writing style, and I found it more interesting to read than any of the others, because really it's not just like a vitriolic attack on religion. You might think it's complete bullshit, but it's an attempt to elaborate this theoretical framework involving memes and analyze the history of religion. And to me, it reads a lot like when Freud writes on anthropological topics or something. And there's a certain amount of bullshit going on there, but I mostly enjoy it regardless. So I think I read almost all of this book over the past year at various times. And it's difficult to get a handle on a lot of what out of just one chapter, because he's building up this theory of memes and how you can apply evolutionary reasoning to the treatment of the spread of ideas. We picked the one chapter, Belief in Belief, as the thing to focus on.
There's part of it that goes along the lines of saying, look, to do anything, you're going to have to make some assumptions that are extrapolations, whether they be from my experience explicitly with my educated guesses and so forth. He develops this more into saying, well, I have good reasons for my belief in certain things based upon the way I understand the authority of certain kinds of experts. And I have good reasons for ceding authority to those experts. So part of his argument about E equals MC squared was that he understands that pretty well, but the fact is that most people believe in E equals MC squared because they believe in the authority of Einstein and so forth. And all of this seems to be wrapped around the notion, what he calls belief in belief, which is that we end up having unfounded, I'll call them just assumptions or things that we take for granted that some people might call beliefs that we would believe we have to have just to get through life.
Right, he's concerned with characteristics that ideas, such as religious ideas, could have built into them that will make them more likely to spread. And one of these is a defense mechanism about questioning it, so that two religious ideas, one of which says, like Schleiermacher, that, oh, I would never impose my belief on you, if it's competing with another belief system that is very possessive and says, if you doubt, you will go to hell, or we will kill you, then it is much more likely historically for the more repressive types of belief systems to have propagated themselves, right? On analogy with a survival advantage that an animal might have. And we're not talking about the survival of the believers. We're talking about the survival of the belief itself, that being sort of the replicating unit. So one of the things that he thinks is really rife in our culture is this belief that even if you don't, just looking at the evidence yourself, believe in God, say, you might have the sentiment that you believe that you should believe in God, right? That religion is a good thing and fake it till you make it.
He explains that there's an ultimate division of labor, the division of stochastic labor made possible by language. We lay people do the believing. We sign on to the doxicology and defer the understanding of those dogmas to the experts. He says, even scientists rely every day on formulas that they know to be correct but are not themselves expert in interpreting. They sometimes even foster the separation of understanding and memorization. A vivid instance can be found in Feynman's QED, The Strange Theory of Light and Matter, in which he amusingly cajoles his audience to loosen their grip and not try to understand the method he is teaching.
So this is just a general fact about human behavior that he's elaborating here. Religious belief systems can use this as another way of sort of passing themselves on and insulating themselves. And, you know, he thinks It may describe a lot of how people who are religious, but they're not themselves priests or something, think of it. They get some meaning out of it, but they ultimately don't pretend to understand the mysteries. And of course, this could then lead to even the clergy having that opinion. So everybody thinks somebody else knows what's going on, but really it's ultimately hollow. I don't think he goes so far as to state that that is clearly what is happening with all religious belief systems, but that is something that an idea could use to propagate itself.
Where the belief in that idea is more important than the idea itself.
Exactly. So in section 4 of this, the lowest common denominator says, we've just seen that our concept of belief allows that there's a clear empirical difference between two states of mind, belief in God and belief in God. But here's a perplexing question. Of all the people who believe in a belief in God, what percentage roughly actually believe in God? Investigating this empirical question turns out to be extremely difficult.
Isn't this like the Europeans for a long time believing that tomatoes were poisonous? Or maybe it was the English. That would persist as a kind of people not testing it, and I guess this would go to a certain kind of social taboo.
Like Harris, like these others, he's saying we need to not tiptoe around religion. And Dennett is specifically concerned with scientific inquiry into religion, like anthropologists of religion. Among a lot of them, there's this, we have to be careful not to offend anyone. There's this inherent antipathy to being studied, like that diminishes you in some way. If you read on to the end of the Dennett book, he has a chapter, What Do We Do Now? It's all very tentative and, we just need to study this stuff more. And again, your ideas have to be able to compete. You have to remain open-minded. Dawkins has this whole screed about how it's child abuse to teach children religion before they're of an age to understand it. Right? Especially if you're teaching them, like, if you do this, you're going to go to hell. Like, how many people, and he's, again, speaking from this sort of English schoolboy experience, does that scare the shit out of? Even the story of Noah's Ark, which was something I heard as a kid fairly innocently, but just that, God is just going to wipe you all out if you're bad. Like, there's, but Dennett, what he has to say about that is, well, none of that is child abuse unless it closes your mind from thinking of further things, right? So unless it is a meme, an idea system that is so internally self-defending that you're never going to be able to have a reasonable conversation with other people for the rest of your lives, then it's fine.
And there are plenty of scientists in the United States who are religious.
Yeah, Kenny is dismissive of that sort of concern as well. He says that, would Dawkins object to people teaching their kids about Santa Claus? I mean, that doesn't mean they're going to grow up to be rabid Santa Clausians. There's a certain amount of ritual and things involved in childhood, especially if you're trying to express your traditions or whatever. There are lots of legitimate reasons for bringing kids into this. As long as you're not brainwashing them too hard, they can get over it.
And there are very subtle ways in which people are fucking their kids up, which you can't do anything about, which you can't give a general name to, like religion. It's just a matter of the way their character affects the character of their children.
Right. Dennett points out, so he has a chapter where he talks about this whole, what do you teach your children? And the fact that we all sort of, as soon as the conversation gets on the thought of the state intervening between you and your children, then we all kind of get huffy about that. And he wants to take that as an anthropological datum. Don't just the fact that you have that reaction, take that as, it's the God's honest truth that people have the right to teach their kids whatever they want. No, there's a strong evolutionary reason for us to have that belief about our kids. And you can sort of look at it the same way Dylan was talking at the very beginning about our need to control our kids, to make them think like we do, to make them obey. So that these things are not necessarily obviously bad or obviously good, but we just need to be skeptical and treat them as data to be analyzed. And I don't know, there's nothing too objectionable in those sections of this book, at least. I guess the more serious thing is just for people that are reading this as another one of the new atheists and don't see anything that is persuasive for them to become atheists. And so therefore the book is shit and has nothing to say. Or as is probably Wes's view, that they think that the theoretical apparatus he's building up is bullshit. Which we don't have time to go into, unfortunately. All right, closings.
What's your closing, Seth?
I'm glad this is over with.
The discussion or the having to read these guys and dwell in their worlds?
A little of both.
But we should mention that Seth was against this from the beginning, right?
Yes.
Thank you for showing up anyway.
I have to say, I feel like I probably could have given this a little bit more effort than I did. But one thing that struck me first off is the difference in styles between the writers, right? Reading Dennett, I was just like, wow, this really sounds like a philosophy guy writing about something that's like way out of his league. It had that feel to it. And Hitchens, I find actually very amusing, and I enjoyed reading him. But there's this current that I guess we sort of touched on in the discussion, but is very explicit in most of these, which is something like there's the science versus religion, or scientific methodology or a scientific worldview versus a religious worldview. And there's either an explicit declaration or an implicit assumption that the two things cannot exist side by side or coexist somehow. And in reading some of it, I questioned whether that was a meaningful or necessary distinction to make, to say that we have a methodology and we have proof for X. And since we do, we ought to apply that to everything else. And it reminded me of the Hayek that I think I'd mentioned at one of our previous episodes, the Counter-Revolution in Science, where he basically says that economics, for example, is not a subject matter for which scientific method is appropriate. That the 20th century saw the advent of turning everything into a science and trying to apply scientific methodology to everything, whereas in reality, scientific method is good for explaining how objects in the world relate to other objects, but does not do a very good job of explaining how human beings interact with objects or how they interact with each other. That was Hayek's point. And he's sort of making an argument in favor of a different methodology for the social sciences, of which he considers economics to be one. And so a lot of the stuff that's in here that's argumentative just kind of rings hollow for me, because I think, well, if there's a debate going on or if there's a war to be won, it was won already. It's clear. Science has provided the world with lots of fun gadgets, but it's very clear that the majority of people in the world see the world not necessarily from a scientific worldview, but from a religious worldview. And to think that the game is being played on the same playing field, that there's going to be some sort of rational discourse where people who believe are going to say, okay, well, let me examine my belief rationally. And you know what? You're right. There really aren't any good arguments for the existence of God. Okay, guess I'm not going to believe anymore. It's just naive and ridiculous. So I think I'll have to spend some more time thinking about what these guys are trying to accomplish with these texts, because that's clearly not it. And as Dylan said, maybe they're preaching to the converted already. But I do believe that the motivations that are driving them to do this are legitimate and sound, that there definitely seems to be a culture war going on, at least here in the United States. There's danger and issues with religious fundamentalism in lots of different places in the world. I just don't know that trying to deal with that by taking a position as an atheist is going to in any way, shape, or form be productive.
Very nice. Dylan?
I end up similarly to the end of what Seth said. In terms of arguing, trying to convince people to get along better and play well with others, that kind of thing, I don't know that any of them really are making that argument. Especially, at least two of them are very explicitly political without engaging in a discussion about political life. Maybe it's just typical, but I found it sort of unfortunate that they didn't speak of how you have a political existence in a community that allows for, maybe in Harris's point of view, less cruelty. And then as far as some of the more philosophical bents, maybe at the end, the fact is I'm just unsympathetic and just not very interested in the question of whether God exists or not. It's not even from explicitly being atheist or not. I feel like I hardly have the effort to be so actively against the idea. I just have a hard time getting all excited about it, because I feel like there are so many more interesting and captivating and mysterious things right in front of my face all the time in the world that are so confusing that I feel like the question of whether God exists or not is just kind of boring. And in some ways that was confirmed by reading these, because they spend all their time trying to either cherry pick things that sound so ridiculous that you feel like, well, you're going to have to really beat the bushes to find some Yahoo who believes that. They're sort of strawman arguments. Or they're explicitly political, and so they have nothing to do with anything other than starting from the point, well, if you really believe X, Y, or Z, then let's follow that out. But I just find the idea of the existence of God just not very interesting at the end of the day. But it doesn't keep me awake at night.
Well, that's definitely where we were coming from at the start of this podcast, which is why we didn't do this quite a while ago.
I think I'm the one here who finds the existence of God stuff interesting.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting politically, which is why I was disappointed about the lack of political discourse about how we make a community when we have so many people with disparate views. But, if I get down to it and I say, I think that everybody has things that they believe in the strong and weak sense. They get them through their lives, and also they have revisions of those as they go through their lives. And maybe, in fact, I wouldn't even say maybe, I say certainly, for a lot of people, they get their compass for their actions, both amongst other people and just for themselves, by God or what they attribute to being God. I would find it much more interesting to talk about the explicit things that a person believes rather than, I guess I find God not being very explicit. Like, I don't even know what God is at this point, right?
So you prefer like a Carol Gilligan type of interview book? Like, there are plenty of those out there.
Yeah, I guess I would find it a little bit more interesting to talk about that. But like in this whole thing, when we talk about the God delusion or God is not great and breaking the spell, what you mean by God and belief and faith, it's a many articulated thing. And I don't even know what it is when people say they believe in God. After a conversation with them, I can kind of understand the universe of ideas that they attribute to it. But I don't even know what such a being is, what such an entity or idea is. And I think that even in the conversation we had, where we didn't really talk about what God is at all, you could tell that we were bandying about all kinds of different assumptions about what one would mean and what would be legitimate possibilities and illegitimate possibilities, which ones we're going to throw out right from the beginning and which ones we're going to entertain. So I find it's kind of imprecise and at the end of the day, kind of boring.
I think Dennett would agree with you that that's why the book is not about what kind of God is there really, but it's about what kind of gods do people believe in over time, and what exactly is the sort of the competitive advantage between having one versus another in your personal life, and sort of how sociologically that makes people flock from one to another. So I guess that's why I ultimately found that book more interesting, even though I'm kind of skeptical about the whole framework, and I really would have to read a lot more about memes and things to make up my mind of whether it's really just, as Pat Churchland said on our episode with her, just talk about it as good ideas spreading, but that doesn't seem to capture what he wants to talk about with the parasitic memes and things like that. Anyway, so I found that interesting in its own way. I found the Dawkins, I actually listened to that as an audiobook, and he reads a large portion of it, and then has some woman.
I did it as an audiobook too, yeah.
Yeah, and I like hearing him speak. I might have enjoyed the Hitchens if I had heard him saying it. And I appreciate Dawkins as an expert in his area and wouldn't mind not just reading his books, but reading more in that area of natural selection. And maybe there's room for another episode at some point specifically on that, reading somebody or another, reading Darwin himself or something. I'm sure we'll turn to that topic at some point.
Yeah, we should definitely do a philosophy of biology.
But then the other guys, the Hitchens and the Harris, again, I think there's a purpose for those books. And there was definitely a time in my life where at least reading small portions of it would have been, and in the case of Harris, was kind of elating. I even just got the Harris book for my dad for a Father's Day gift this year, even after reading enough of it to say that, like, wow, I can't make myself read more than these 2 chapters. Like, I just am so not interested in this. I just feel like I'm not the target audience, and they're picking the low-hanging fruit. And I guess I haven't made up my mind whether they're destructive enough to outweigh their entertainment qualities. Certainly, I don't think they achieve what they want to politically. Which is better, one of those or a Michael Moore book? All right, Wes, you get the last word. Is there anything you haven't already said?
Probably not.
Say something nice.
I might just have to say nothing. Yeah, but I am fundamentally interested in these for whatever reason, even though I'm not religious.
So did you enjoy reading the books?
They generally just, other than Dennett, I mean, Dennett's was interesting, but the other 3 just made me angry. And I just thought, oh, it's garbage. But, and I did a lot of other reading, trying to find actual philosophical responses, which seem to be pretty rare, actually. I think I found the few that there are. I found the 3 papers that I sent you guys, including the Kenny.
Responses to these guys,
yeah, like
as
direct.
Opposed to better ways of arguing atheism. Like somebody recommended the Walter Kaufman book, Faith of a Heretic. And I got it out of the library, and it was this just fat, thing filled with discussions of Nietzsche, and I couldn't bring it to bear here. But I'm sure there's better stuff out there.
Yeah, as someone who's certainly an atheist about an intervening kind of God, and then an agnostic otherwise, and an atheist about a Christian God, let's say. So I would be a person who's actually open to, if I thought there were a good argument, to be an atheist. But the fact that they're making such poor quality arguments, I don't think helps them. And especially when they're waving around the banner of reason and science and then making bad arguments in the name of it, I don't think it's a good PR move.
Yes, there's certainly more that we should say in future episodes on philosophy of science, and I don't think the word scientism was said once in this discussion. But you can read plenty of that already on, say, the Sam Harris post on our blog recently. So I encourage folks to go to partiallyexaminedlife.com and participate in this debate and tell us in just really as offensive manner as possible where we were being unfair, how we don't understand religion at all, and we should get somebody who actually knows what they're talking about to be on this. We really love all the comments like that.
Do we really get comments like that?
Occasionally. I just overreact to all of them. Next time, we are going to read more about moral sentiments. So we're going to read selections from Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments and some more David Hume to get the rest of us in on that discussion. We just decided, since they both wrote very fat books on that, I decided to just let a different editor choose the selections for us. So we all have access to a book called British Moralists 1650 to 1800, Volume 2. I will put a post on partiallyexaminedlife.com that actually gives you the page numbers and the original sources if you require that. Join our Facebook group. Go on iTunes, give us a good rating. Follow us on Twitter. Send episodes to your friends and family. Love us, because we love you. Thanks to all the folks that participated on this and all that are listening. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
I don't need a target to be pissed off. I don't need a self to hate it. I don't feel the need to customize content to fit the situation. Fill to the brim with chemicals produced by only me. I don't know what it's worth to say so. I've played out and I've got to rest for years if it proves necessary. God damn it, the only refrain. God damn it, for no special reason. God damn it, 'cause I'm tired of being alive today. God damn it, my only refrain. God damn it, for various reasons. God damn it. Necessary, God damn it, my only refrain. God damn it, for no special reason. God damn it, 'cause I'm tired of being alive today. God damn it, my only refrain. God damn it, for various reasons. God damn it. And I thank you for the inspiration, and I'm grateful for your expectations, but none of it's enough to make my fondest dreams come true. 'Cause I don't want another revelation, and I can't take divine illumination. My problems are a part of me, and I don't wanna talk about it. God damn it, my only refrain. God damn it, with no special reason. reason. God damn it, 'cause I